Hello YouTube, welcome back. I'm starting this video at Lismore on the banks of the now infamous Wilson's River, and it's 23rd September 2022 and the area has had a nice big dousing of rain. You know, 50 millimeters in areas. It's not a huge dousing of rain, but at the start of the La Nina that we've been warned about, just 50 millimeters of rain can get the rivers looking very angry like this, because the ground is already pretty wet, and whenever new water falls on it, it just tends to run off from places like Rosebank down to this river via tributaries like Cooper's Creek. And it's a bit of a harbinger for the season, where we know that, like the last 2 years of La Ninas, macadamia farmers are going to face another wet year. What does that mean if you have a macadamia farm, and how best can you take advantage of it or deal with the disadvantages of it? Of course, there's one good lesson for what you don't want to do in response to flood, and that is something that looks good and sounds good but does nothing for you. And I'm still in Lismore here at the Browns Creek pumping station. Now, this big concrete monster with pipes leading out there was a government initiative to pump the drains of Lismore, which is built on a floodplain, clean, so that when drains got inundated in the main streets, the Browns pumps would come on and pump the water into Browns Creek. And it sounded good, and it certainly made a lot of noise when they fired them up, but in reality what happened was the pumps would become quickly inundated. They'd do no good for clearing the streets of Lismore, and then when the pumps themselves got flooded from being too close to the river, of course they were switched off and they did no good anymore. So it's one of those things that governments do sometimes. When they know there's a problem, they agree that something must be done, but they're really more interested in something being seen to be done. And just for historical interest, there's a chart of where the flood levels were. There's the 12.4 metres up the top from 1974. And of course, there's a handwritten mark of 14.5 metres, which was where the 2022 flood came to. So that old scale, of course, is now completely out of date and outclassed on what is a very large, tall building by the river in Lismore. So you don't want to do something that, you know, just makes you feel good. Farmers need to do something that actually works. One, because we don't really have huge margins to waste and we can't tax people. And two, macadamia trees aren't fooled by things that look good. They just want to do their job and make some nuts for you if at all possible. So back to the question, what is it that we do? Of course, one thing that's good in the rain is the planting of baby macadamia trees. These are the last three of my $6 specials here. They've been sitting patiently in their bags, waiting to be planted out in gaps, and springtime is a good time to do them. I just planted one of them yesterday, and it was already been rained in beautifully by these current showers. And instead of the curse of a dry spring, you've got the benefit of a wet spring where you'll get regular moisture and some warmth to these babies, giving them the same sort of chance as when you plant them in autumn, which in the northern rivers is warm and wet, and usually the ideal time to plant young macadamia trees. So that's one thing you can do. But what about the big trees, the ones that are going to give you the crop? Well, we're going to separate the topics into flower and cultivation, and eventually nut and harvesting. So when it comes to the flower of macadamia trees, and I realise I've got listeners all over the world at the moment, which still surprises me, but the macadamia was native to this area it evolved to have a flower that was susceptible to rain. Not deliberately so. A couple of kangaroos over there. But the flower's susceptible to rain because the tree itself natively flowers in August and September here in the southern hemisphere, and those are the two driest months of the year in the northern rivers of New South Wales and southeast Queensland. So I guess in the evolutionary process they never really tried to evolve flowers that were rainproof because they didn't get it. What happens if you do get it? How do you protect these babies? Now, it's not so much that rain spoils the flowers. To be more accurate, it's the hanging around of moisture on the flowers for a long period of time that spoils them. So the odd rain shower followed by sun, not much of a problem. You won't get too much damage from that. But if you've got rain followed by several cloudy, cool days, or you've just got a lot of rain, you'll basically get the flowers to suffer from what we call grey mould, or there's other words for it. Botrytis is one of them, which is a kind of rot. And once that happens, the flowers can't pollinate, can't set nut. You basically lose any crop that you might have got from those flowers, whether the bees are active or not. And that's a little bit of a shame. Kanga. Anyway, the difficulty with that is that, you know, what can you do to stop the flowers from rotting? And there's no actual registered fungicide for flower blight in macadamias, or at least not in 2022. And there are some farmers who are experimenting with fungicides that do deal with flower blight in other species, like avocados, fungicides like Custodia, and I think there's been some experiments with Merivon. The problem is these aren't registered for use on macadamias, and the legality of using those chemicals that aren't registered are hazy, to say the least. And you don't know, of course, if they are going to do any good. Once you spray your orchard with those things, it's very hard to get a comparison, I suppose, on orchards that aren't sprayed. I suppose if you sprayed one block as an experiment and then looked at the yield afterwards, it might give you some indication, but there's so many different things that can affect yield. A little bit hard to get a grip on. So that's flower. What about feeding? Now, you know, broadly speaking, you can feed macadamias by foliar feeding, and I'm not going to touch much on that because it is an ineffective feeding method for the most part. It just doesn't give enough nutrient to the trees unless you're talking about trace elements like boron and possibly zinc. The other two kinds of food, and the main ones, are the granular chemical fertilizers and the manure-based fertilizers. Now, all of them operate a certain way. You put them on the soil, they release their nutrients into the soil one way or another. They eventually get down to the root zone and are converted or taken up by the trees. With the manure, you have an additional process whereby microbes in the soil convert the manure into usable nutrients that the plant can take up. In chemical form, particularly the fast-release chemical forms, the chemicals can be absorbed directly by the plant, but aren't always superior. Now, when there's heavy rain around, well, look, first principles, when you put dry fertiliser on soil, it doesn't get to the tree's roots without moisture. So you do need moisture. So that's first principles. But if you get too much moisture, what will happen with chemical fertilisers is they will leach right through the soil, past the roots and, you know, out the other end into the water table or into the rivers, and, you know, certainly nowhere where they'll do your trees any good, and they'll probably do damage somewhere else. That's, you know, A, environmentally irresponsible, and B, a waste of money. With manures, well, there's slower release, and there are some slower release chemical fertilisers or rock-based minerals that do leach very slowly, and they're very compatible with rainy weather. I'm a very rare devotee of Osmocote for my baby macadamias, and that is very slow release and able to cope with very high amounts of rainfall because it just simply doesn't leach very much more nutrient at a time. It's a very slow release fertilizer. And well, the results are here. Look at this 788. This 788 is now maybe 12 foot high. It's only a couple of years old. Amazing tree, and it's got a nice big long flower raceme for the first time this year. All these babies were raised on Osmocote, but also with a combination of pellet-based manure. So, wet season, you would gravitate towards the manure-based, the slow-release-based fertilizers, because, you know, at least in heavy rainfall, you know that whatever it is won't be just washed off and down the hill instead of staying underneath your trees where it's going to do some good. Spraying, well, I guess the two parts of spraying is, well, insect and fungus, and in a wet season, the insect pressure can be a little higher than a dry season, but there isn't much in it. In fact, there's less insect pressure from mites in a wet season because mites, part of the spider family, hate the wet. They can't stand a bath. So you certainly won't be spraying abamectin for mites in a wet season, unless you've got rocks in your head. But other pests, well, there are some pesticides that are contact, where you have to contact the insect. There are other newer generation pesticides which are systemic. That is, when you spray them, they get into the sap system of the plant, and any insect that tries to eat your plant basically sucks its own death. Systemic insecticides are far more rain resistant because they do get into the sap flow of the plant. The contact ones will wash off with rain. Now, to an extent that you do have to use some contact insecticides, there are additives that you can put into your spray that are basically different kinds of oil. And one of the common ones is called Designer. It's also called a sticker. People call it a sticker. Basically means that it mixes with the spray, and when it goes onto the tree and dries, it makes a nice rain-fast barrier, so that the effect of the insecticide you're using, or even fungicide in fact, much greater and much more resistant to rain. It's not a perfect resistance, but it's certainly going to add to the effectiveness of what you're spraying. Last thing you want is to spray and then have it rain the next day, and you know that all your spray has basically washed off and you've lost a few $1,000s. Designer, like any other oil product, goes up with oil prices, but, you know, I've got to say, you know, if you can spray for $3,500 and get it rain fast, or spray for $3,000 and have it open to risk, I'd be paying the $3,500 every time. Now, fungicide. Well, we've spoken about fungus on the flowers and that we can't really legally do anything about that. But on some varieties of macadamia, husk spot, and to a lesser extent husk rot, can ruin nuts by making them drop early. Big black spots on the husk of a macadamia can basically wreck the nut, cause it to be a reject for being immature in particular. But yeah, you just generally won't get that as far as a harvest. The only long-term remedy, of course, is to grow varieties that are not husk spot susceptible. They tend to call them husk spot tolerant. And certainly all my new plantings have been chosen for tolerance to husk spot, except for these 246s over here, which do have a bit of susceptibility to husk spot, but they have a nice big yield that tends to compensate a lot for that. Other husk spot susceptible varieties include A4, A16, or not so much A4 actually, 849. There's several others that are susceptible, more or less, and there's some other really well-behaved varieties like 741, to some extent 660, the new varieties G, J, R, P, MCT1. husk spot resistance was one of the key things they were chosen for. But of course that doesn't help you if you've got an established orchard. In an established orchard, what a wet season means is that you've got to be on your guard to protect your crop, and that means you don't want to skip on your spray for husk spot. And the current latest wisdom is that you don't use the same product twice. You use different fungicides to get a more rounded approach to the problem. The first one can be a sophisticated one like Custodia, Cabrio, Merivon, and you can follow up with a copper-based one if you believe in copper. You can look at the Macadamia show with Peter Fraser. He's not a believer in copper. I sort of am, although he does make a very good point that once you spray leaves with copper and they fall on the ground, they tend to hang around forever because it's so effective. So, you know, you can get a little bit of an increased cost in fungicides if you have husk spot susceptible varieties. I tend not to bother with my trees. My neighbour's got a lot of A38s and they're quite susceptible to husk spot. Because they're such a lovely crop, it's definitely worth protecting with spray in their case. So what about harvesting? Well, 2022 was a real school for macadamia farmers in terms of trying to get your harvest in when it wasn't absolutely pouring. And what we learned, particularly from the smaller farms, was that the smaller harvesters, like the Rob Mac harvesters and the Nifty Nabbers, actually do okay in the wet because they're not carving deep tracks in the mud. They can be fairly nimble. And once it's sunny for a few days, you can get out and about on them. Whereas the really heavy harvesters don't really get much traction in deep mud, and they can run into a lot of trouble and cause a lot of orchard damage, particularly to the interrows. So that was one thing. The other thing, of course, is it put an absolute burden on our nut processors at Summerland House and other dehusking facilities, to the point where, you know, some farmers who had long disused dehusking units started to think about firing them up and using them again, and that's a turn up for the books. It also revealed a large shortage of contractor labour available, and that was a real problem in the sense that once the weather fined up, everyone wanted to skip, everyone wanted their contract harvester to show up, and it was quite a while before we had any real interaction with some harvest contractors. They were just so flat out. Their machines were running ragged. They were trying to pick up harvest with, you know, finger wheels that were being ripped up by muddy pastures, and there were some lost tempers. And also the efficiency of the harvest was very much down. Is there a solution for that? Well, no, there isn't. But I think, you know, definitely the lessons are there that are stronger than ever before. That is, keep your grass down. That way, if it does fine up, the ground will dry quicker, and the harvesters will have fewer problems getting nut out of the ground, where it's probably sort of sitting in some loose soil anyway. And that's how you can hopefully protect as much of the crop as possible. What about things that are longer term, like pruning and canopy management? Well, one of the things people forget about rainy seasons is that a lot of rain also means less sun. And so if you've got closed over canopies and the trees aren't getting enough sunlight to start with, a rainy year is really bad news for you, as it was for my old blocks, because, you know, they were starved for sun anyway. You would argue that these older blocks are actually best suited to a drought year, because the older closed over canopy keeps the ground a bit more shaded, keeps the moisture in the ground a little longer, and the very tops of the trees, which are getting sun, almost get enough to produce a decent crop for you. But just in those wet years, you've got to look at if there's a recurring theme of wet years. You'd want the tree canopy down so that you've got maximum possible sun exposure when the sun does come out. And you also want this lovely ground cover to thrive, because there's nothing that stops erosion like grass and ground cover. And you know, it just means that when you do have wet ground, you're not going to have your topsoil flow off into the nearest creek. It's better at trapping your nuts so that they don't flow off into the nearest creek. It's just all around good. So those are the implications in a wet year for macadamias. This is what we've learned in the last 2 years. We've got this year to implement those lessons and try and make a better show of it. I certainly am going to, and I hope that we will get something out of what seems to be a good flowering season. Thanks for watching, guys. Sorry for any wind in the microphone. It's just one of those cold, miserable days on Nutkin Farm, but I thought I'd come and make the video anyway. Bye for now.